She called me sweetheart when she said it. That's the part people always miss when I tell this story. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sneer. It was soft, almost gentle, the way you talk to a child who wandered into the wrong room. "Sweetheart," my cousin said, leaning close enough that I could smell her perfume. "Something expensive, something I definitely could not afford. You really shouldn't be standing near the bidding floor. The help uses the side entrance." She smiled when she said it, touched my arm, then turned back to her husband and laughed at something he said, and that was it. I was dismissed, erased, a smudge on the edge of her perfect day. I didn't move right away. I stood there holding my coffee cup, gas station coffee, the kind with the cardboard sleeve, and I looked around the room. The Hargrove Estate auction hall was packed, ranchers in good boots, land attorneys with leather briefcases, a few buyers I recognized from agricultural conferences, the quiet type who show up in trucks and leave, having bought half a county. And then there was my cousin Diane's side of the room, her husband's family, all silk ties and cocktail dresses at 9 in the morning, acting like this was a gala instead of an estate liquidation. I found a chair near the back wall, next to the water table, and I sat down. I set my coffee on the floor beside me. I folded my hands in my lap. "Before I tell you what happened when that gavel came down, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know how far this one travels." I didn't always have a reason to be quiet. When I was younger, I was the loud one, the one who asked too many questions at Thanksgiving, who spent every summer following my grandfather around the property, asking him to name every breed by sight, demanding he explain why the east pasture mattered more than the north field during a dry year. He always answered. He never once told me I was too much. My grandfather, I called him Pop, everyone did, had built the Hargrove Ranch from 40 acres of nothing into something that took 20 minutes to drive across. Cattle mainly. Black Angus, a small herd of Herefords he kept for what he called sentimental reasons, and a quarter-horse operation that had more ribbons in the barn than I could count as a kid. The land was his whole life. He told me once that you don't own land, you just get to take care of it for a while, and then you pass it on to whoever loves it the same way you did. He said that to me specifically. I didn't understand it then. I do now. When Pop died 3 years ago, the family came apart the way families do when there's something real to fight over. His will was complicated. He'd left the ranch to the estate, pending a full appraisal and settlement of debts, with a note that read, "The land goes to whoever has the patience to see this through." His attorney had rolled with that about as well as you'd expect, which is to say there were 6 months of conference calls and more legal paper than I'd ever seen in my life. Diane, my mother's sister's daughter, had driven down from Atlanta the week after the funeral in a rented Escalade with her husband and her in-laws and her husband's business attorney. She had a plan. She told my mother, she told everyone, that she intended to purchase the estate at appraisal value, consolidate the land with her husband's holdings in East Texas, and that this was really the most sensible outcome for everyone involved. She said sensible, like she was doing us a favor. I didn't argue with her. I never argued with Diane. In our family, Diane had been the golden one since we were children. She married well. She moved to the right city. She sent Christmas cards with professional photos, and her kids had normal names, and she always had the right thing to say at family gatherings, which mainly meant she knew how to make everyone feel slightly worse about their own lives while smiling the entire time. I had stayed. That was my crime in her mind. I had stayed in Millhaven, Texas. I worked the land. I helped Pop during the years when his knees gave out, and then when the dementia started. And it was just the two of us most mornings, me driving the truck along the fence line while he pointed at things and told me their names like I hadn't known them since I was 6 years old. I held his hand in the hospital. I made decisions about medications, and I called the family, and I handled the paperwork when it was over. I drove a 2009 F-150 with a crack in the windshield, and I wore the same 3 pairs of jeans in rotation, and I did not own a single item of clothing that Diane would consider appropriate for an event like this. She knew that. She counted on it. The estate auction had been set for a Saturday in April. A genuine public auction required by the settlement terms. Any heir could bid. Outside buyers could bid. Fair market process. Diane had arrived the night before with her husband's financial advisor and 2 lawyers, and had spent the evening at the hotel in town, doing what I can only assume was victory laps in her head. I had arrived that morning, alone. Gas station coffee. The same jeans I wore on Tuesday. She'd spotted me near the bidding floor and done the math the way people like Diane always do. She saw the clothes. She saw the truck through the window. She calculated that I was not a threat. And then she'd called me sweetheart and pointed me toward the side entrance and turned back to her real life. I found my chair by the water table, and I sat down and I waited. Here is something people don't know about me, something I kept quiet for a long time, because in my family, keeping things quiet was a survival strategy. I didn't stay in Millhaven because I couldn't leave. I stayed because Pop asked me to. About 8 months before he died, on a morning when his mind was still mostly clear, he sat me down at the kitchen table and he told me what he'd decided to do. He'd spent the last 2 years of his life quietly restructuring the estate with his attorney, a man named Gerald who drove out from San Antonio once a month and who I had assumed, wrongly, was just handling end-of-life paperwork. What he was actually doing was transferring ownership of the cool acreage, 1,847 acres, the original homestead, the working cattle operation, the quarter horse facility, into a separate LLC, Hargrove Land and Livestock LLC. Sole member, me. Filed with the Texas Secretary of State 14 months before his death. The estate that was being auctioned today was the remainder. The house, the equipment sheds, the second pasture he'd bought in 1989. Real money, real land, but not the heart of it. Pop had looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "You're the one who knows what it's worth. Don't let them auction off what they don't understand." I hadn't told anyone, not my mother, not the attorneys handling the estate, not Diane. Gerald knew. Gerald was sitting in the 3rd row in his good suit with a bidding paddle and a very calm expression. I looked at the auction registration desk near the front door. I had registered that morning, quietly, before most people arrived. My paddle was number 24. It was sitting in my jacket pocket. The auctioneer called the room to order at 10 o'clock sharp. Diane settled into the front row with her husband and their attorney. She had a paddle. Her father-in-law had a paddle. They had a strategy. I'd overheard enough of it in the parking lot to understand they planned to drive the bidding to a number that would price out any local buyers, secure the full parcel, and then combine it with their East Texas operation to create something they were calling a regional agricultural asset. Her father-in-law had used that exact phrase, regional agricultural asset, like it was a portfolio line item and not the ground my grandfather had broken with his hands. The bidding started on the equipment package. Tractors, implements, irrigation systems. I let that go. Diane's side swept it up. Her father-in-law was nodding along like a man who had already decided the outcome. Then the house parcel came up. The original homestead, 200 acres surrounding it. The barn Pop had rebuilt after the fire in 2004. I raised paddle 24. Diane turned around when the auctioneer acknowledged me. She blinked. Once. Twice. Like she was recalibrating something. She turned back and raised her paddle. I raised mine. She went higher. I matched her. Her husband leaned over and said something to her attorney. I could see the confusion starting to move across their little group. This slow, uncomfortable realization that the woman in the jeans by the water table was still in the room. We went back and forth. The number climbed past what I knew they'd projected. I watched her attorney's jaw tighten. I watched her father-in-law pull out his phone and start doing something with his calculator. At $2.3 million, Diane turned around and looked directly at me. Not the polite dismissal from before. This was different. She was trying to figure out what she was dealing with. I looked back at her. She raised her paddle. I raised mine. At $2.6 million, her attorney touched her arm and said something low and firm, and her paddle stayed down. The gavel came down. Diane stood up immediately. She turned around and walked toward me, her heels loud on the hardwood. Her husband 2 steps behind her with that smile men wear when they think they can still fix things. "That was impressive," she said. Her voice was still smooth, but the edges had gone sharp. "Where on earth did you—" She stopped, recalculated. "You don't have that kind of capital. Are you financing this? Because I should tell you, operating a ranch without adequate— I'm not financing it," I said. "Then who is?" She looked behind me like she expected to find someone, a husband, an investor, some man who was the actual answer to the question she was asking. There was no one behind me. "Diane," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice was. I had been afraid it would shake. "Do you know what Hargrove Land and Livestock LLC is?" She stared at me. "Pop transferred the working operation to me 14 months before he died. The cattle, the horses, the original acreage, the 1,847 acres you've been driving past all weekend thinking it was part of the estate sale. It wasn't." I paused. "It's been mine for over a year." The color left her face in stages. First her forehead, then her cheeks. "That's not," she started. "Gerald has the documentation," I said. "He's been Pop's attorney for 30 years. You're welcome to call your people." Her husband had his phone out before I finished the sentence. I watched the math happening behind her eyes. The East Texas Consolidation Plan, the regional agricultural asset, all of it built on the assumption that the heart of the Hargrove operation was available to buy, that the girl in the bad jeans was just a footnote, a minor relative who had showed up for the free coffee and didn't understand what a bidding floor was for. She had calculated wrong. I don't like scenes. I want to be clear about that. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys a public moment. I had no interest in humiliating Diane in front of the ranching community and the land attorneys and the buyers who were now watching us with the particular careful interest of people who know they're witnessing something private and important. But I also need to be honest about what I felt standing there, holding my paddle number 24, wearing my Tuesday jeans, watching her recalibrate everything she thought she knew about me. There was a ledger in my head. There is always a ledger for people who have been written off by their families. You keep it quietly, sometimes for years, and you don't even realize how long the columns have been growing. I thought about the summer I was 24, when my mother called me in a panic because Diane's wedding venue had fallen through 3 months out and she actually said this, she needed me to use my relationship with the Hargrove name to get them into a facility in San Antonio. I made 17 calls. I drove 3 hours to have a conversation in person. I got to the venue. She sent me a card. The card said, "Thanks so much," with 2 exclamation points. I thought about the year after that, when Pop's health started declining and someone had to manage the ranch and the medications and the rotating cast of home health aides, and that someone was me, every single day. While Diane sent thoughtful texts and told everyone at family gatherings that she wished she could be there more, but things were just so busy in Atlanta. I thought about every Christmas where her gifts to me were an afterthought and her gifts to everyone else were curated and considered, because she had decided what I was worth and she had priced me accordingly. I thought about the word sweetheart. "The side entrance," I said. She blinked. "What?" "That's what you told me earlier, that the help uses the side entrance." I held her gaze. "I wanted you to know that I heard you." She opened her mouth, closed it. Her husband was still on his phone. I could hear him asking someone to pull a Texas Secretary of State filing. I had one more thing to say and I had not planned it. It just arrived, the way true things sometimes do when you've been quiet for long enough. "Pop knew what he was doing," I said. "He left the land to someone who understood what it cost. Not just in dollars." I picked up my coffee from the floor where I'd left it. It was cold by then, but I didn't mind. I nodded to Gerald across the room. He gave me a small nod back. I walked out the main entrance. Not the side one. Outside, the April air was still cool, that clean Texas morning cool that burns off fast once the sun gets going. I stood by my truck for a minute and looked out at the east pasture through the fence line. My fence line, as it turned out, had been for over a year. I had driven past it 100 times in that year, knowing it was mine, not saying a word. Pop had said the land goes to whoever loves it the same way you do. He hadn't meant it as a romantic idea. He was a practical man, my grandfather. He meant it as an assessment. He had watched all of us quietly for years, the way old ranchers watch things, without appearing to, without giving any indication that they're evaluating you. And then one day the evaluation is complete and the decision has been made, and it turns out he's been decided for longer than you knew. He decided on me on a Tuesday morning at the kitchen table with bad coffee and a clear head. He decided on me. Diane called that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was about 20 minutes of repositioning. She had some thoughts about a joint management arrangement, about the synergies of combining operations, about how families should work together, especially in situations like this. And wasn't there a way we could all sit down and discuss what Pop would have really wanted? I listened to the whole thing while I drove the fence line in my truck. What Pop would have really wanted. She said it 3 times. I thought about him on the last really good day, maybe 6 weeks before the end, when his mind came back sharp and sudden the way it sometimes did, like a radio finding its signal. We'd been sitting on the porch and he'd pointed at the cattle moving slow across the south pasture, and he'd said, "You know what I love about cattle? They don't care who your husband is." He was laughing when he said it. I didn't call Diane back that day. I didn't call her back the next day either. On the 3rd day, I sent a text. It said, "I appreciate you reaching out. I'm going to be focused on operations for the foreseeable future. Take care." She responded with a lot of words. I didn't read most of them. What I did instead, I called my ranch manager, a woman named Bet, who had worked the property for 11 years and who had watched the whole estate process with the careful neutrality of someone who had seen family fights over land before and knew to stay out of them. I told her we were moving forward with the spring cattle inventory. I told her I wanted to expand the quarter horse program, something Pop had scaled back when the money got tight, something I'd been wanting to restore for 2 years. I told her I was planning to put a small event facility on the northeast corner. Nothing flashy, just a venue for agricultural conferences and maybe the occasional private event because the land could support it and there was demand. Bet said, "Your grandfather talked about that event facility for 15 years. I know, I said, I know. There's a thing that happens when you've been invisible for a long time and then suddenly you're not. It's not triumphant exactly. Movies would have you believe it's triumphant. There's a moment in your own story where the music swells and the lighting is golden and everyone sees you clearly for the first time and it feels like arriving. The real version is quieter. You're standing by your truck in the April cool and you're looking at your fence line and you feel something settle in your chest, this deep and specific weight finally finding the place it was always supposed to land. Not vindication. Not victory. Something older than both of those. Recognition. You were always the one who knew what this was worth. You were always the one who paid the real cost of things. You just had to wait long enough for everyone else to do the math. The land is still there. The cattle are still moving across the south pasture the same way they were moving when Pop and I sat on that porch. Bet had the spring inventory done by the end of the month. The quarter horse program has 4 new additions. The northeast corner is already permitted for the event facility. We break ground in June. I still drive the same truck. The windshield crack is still there. I've been meaning to get it fixed for 2 years, but honestly, at this point it's just part of the truck. Some debts get paid in full. Some relationships reach a point where the accounting is simply done. Not with anger, not with ceremony, just done. Closed. Filed. Diane sends a card every Christmas. It's very nice. It has a professional photo. I still haven't figured out what to write back. I've had a lot of time to think about why Pop did it the way he did. He could have told everyone. He could have called a family meeting, laid out the documents, made it clean and official and public. He didn't. He told me at a kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with bad coffee, and then he went back to watching the cattle through the window like he'd just mentioned the weather. I used to think it was stubbornness, that old man reluctance to explain himself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. But I understand it differently now. He wasn't being secretive. He was being precise. He had spent 80 years watching how people behave when they think no one is keeping score. And he had drawn his conclusions, and he acted on them quietly because that's what integrity actually looks like when it isn't performing for an audience. Diane didn't do anything that morning that she hadn't always done. She looked at me and she ran her numbers and she made her call. The difference was that her numbers were wrong, had always been wrong, and nobody had ever told her because nobody had ever needed to. She had moved through her whole life with a calculator that didn't account for the people she wrote off. That's not cruelty exactly. It's a specific kind of blindness that comes from never being seriously wrong about anything, from always having the resources to paper over the mistakes before they become visible. I was never going to be the one to correct that for her. That's not my job, and it never was. What I could control was what I did with the land, what I did with the years I'd spent learning every fence line and water source and seasonal pattern of the operation. The intelligence I'd built wasn't in a degree or a title. It was in the knowledge of what a piece of ground is actually worth when you've worked it, grieved over it, borrowed against your own future to keep it running. That kind of knowledge doesn't show up in a bidding room until the gavel falls. There's a version of this story where I feel sorry for Diane. I've tried it on. She built an entire strategy around an assumption that turned out to be false, and she didn't find out until she was standing in a room full of ranchers and land attorneys with her husband on the phone and her father-in-law doing math on a calculator that was no longer adding up. That's a hard moment. I don't wish it on people. But I also know that the assumption she built it on, that I was the help, that I was background, that my presence in a room was a problem to be managed rather than a position to be reckoned with. That assumption was a choice she made every time she had the option to make a different one. Every Christmas, every family call, every time she sent a text instead of showing up. The arithmetic was always going to come due. I didn't engineer that, I just waited. Pop used to say that patience isn't passive. He meant it as ranching advice, something about knowing when to let a pasture rest, but it applies to most things. I waited because I trusted what I knew. I trusted the work I had put in and the decisions Pop had made in the land itself, which doesn't care about your plans or your title or what city you flew in from. It just requires someone willing to understand it. That's what I want to hold on to, not the moment the gavel fell, not Diane's expression, not any of it. What I want to hold on to is the Tuesday morning at the kitchen table, the bad coffee, the cattle moving across the south pasture, the old man who looked at me and said, "You're the one who knows what it's worth." That was the real inheritance. Everything else was paperwork.